Hello BookTube. Today I'm going to be doing the top nonfiction tag. This tag originated with Enter the Book and was weaponized by Steve Donahue as he is wont to do. This tag comes at an appropriate moment. In just a few days, well, in a week actually, November will begin, and that means Nonfiction November, a BookTube reading event in which participants read nonfiction in the month of November. If you don't read any nonfiction, well, you can try some nonfiction. If you read a little nonfiction, you can read some more nonfiction. And if you read a whole lot of nonfiction, well, you could devote the entire month's reading to nonfiction, as I'm planning on doing this year. So the idea of this tag is to select 10 books, whether those are your top 10 of all time, or just a random sampling of your top or favorite, however many nonfiction works you have. I'm going to be doing something a little maybe weird. I'm going to be focusing on nonfiction that I've read over the past 2 years since 2020, when I seriously got back into reading nonfiction. One idea I had was maybe to do the top 10 fiction books I read top 10 nonfiction books I read in 2020, since I never did do that top 10 list, which I did for 2021. But I also thought maybe I could do a split. Do 10 of my favorite nonfiction books that I've read since 2020. So it's not a top 10 list of any one year. It will preview maybe some of the top 10 books for this year when I do that at the end of the year. But I think this might be a pretty good way of doing it. So these are my top 10, or a selection of my top 10 nonfiction books since 2020, that I've read since 2020. Hopefully that makes sense. So anyway, so starting with 2020, I have 4. First up is These Truths by Joe Lepore. This is a history of the United States that came out a few years ago, and I really enjoy it. It is an amazing history of the United States. Next up is Maoism, A Global History by Julia Lovell. This is a history of the global impact of Maoism, an offshoot of Marxist ideology generated by Mao Zedong, who was the longtime communist leader of China from 1949 to I'm blanking on exactly when in the 70s. I think it was like 76 or 74, something like that. Anyway, so this is a history of Maoism around the world, and it is a fantastic, fantastic book. Next up is my beloved Big Wonderful Thing, A History of Texas by Stephen Harrigan. This is a wonderful history of the state of Texas. This is history as it should be written. Next up is Post Small, Post Square by Kristina Spohr. This is an amazing history of Europe and from 1989 to the early 90s. It discusses the fall of the Berlin Wall, German unification, Tiananmen Square, the fall of Eastern European communist regimes, the disintegration of the Soviet Union, and this is just a wonderful book. Absolutely love it. Moving on to 2021, I have 3 books, and these make up the top 3 of my top 10 from 2021. First up is Sunny Days by David Kamp. This is a history of children's television from the late 60s through the 70s, and it features Sesame Street, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, the Electric Company, I think Zoom, or at least the first iteration of Zoom, Schoolhouse Rock, and a number of local programs in like New York and Los Angeles. And this is a wonderful, cheery history of children's television before children's television became, for the most part, except for PBS, little more than commercial for toys, as it was in the 80s, even though we could still debate about Sesame Street. Anyway, next up is A World Beneath the Sands, The Golden Age of Egyptology by Toby Wilkinson. This is a fantastic history of early Egyptology from the 18th century into the 19th century, and especially the early 20th century. This is it's a wonderful, wonderful book. I really enjoyed it a lot when I read it. And, of course, my beloved The Age of Decadence, A History of Britain, 1880 to 1914 by Simon Heffer. This is a history of the last years of Queen Victoria's reign and the early reigns of Edward VII and George V, or the reign of Edward VII and the early years of George V. This is a wonderful, wonderful book. I absolutely adore it. Next up are 3 books from 2022 that
Sorry, I don't know that. Did you know I can now give you ideas for popular board games from Amazon? Want to hear one now?
No, Alexa. Sorry about that. She has never done that before. Anyway, getting back on topic. So these are 3 of the nonfiction that I've read in 2022 that are certain to make my top 10 for 2022, which will come probably close to the end of the year, around New Year's Eve, I would think. So I have a bit more time to try to get as many more books read so I can kind of decide. But anyway, so first up is Blood on the River by Marjoleine. This is a history of the Berbice slave revolt that took place in the 1760s, and it's a really, really good book. Just a wonderful work. Next up is Cuba, An American History by Ada Ferrer. This is a look at Cuba through a special focus on its toxic relationship to the United States. And once again, oh boy, is that a toxic relationship. But this is a fantastic book. Just absolutely fantastic. And finally, South to Freedom by Alice L. Baumgartner. This is a history of the enslaved people, particularly in Texas, who, rather than fleeing to Canada, flee to Mexico. During the time when Texas was part of Mexico, and United States citizens were migrating to Texas, there was a lot of controversy in Mexico over whether how to handle the situation. Mexico didn't have slavery as the United States had it. There was an equivalent, but it wasn't as prominent, as politically powerful, and a lot of Mexicans were uncomfortable with U.S.-style slavery. And so those tensions eventually led to Texas secession and eventual joining annexation by the United States as one of the slave states and as a slave power, or supplement to the slave power in the U.S. South, which was for much of American history up until the Civil War one of the dominant forces in the United States. And as Texas seceded, Mexico became almost an emancipatory state where if runaway or fugitive slaves made it to Mexico, they could claim rather quickly freedom and Mexican citizenship. And there are even instances where former owners and their hired mercenaries would enter Mexico trying to recapture the newly emancipated and facing angry local villagers fighting to protect their newly welcomed fellow villagers. It's an amazing book. I really enjoyed it immensely when I read it. So that's one version of my top 10 nonfiction tag, or a top nonfiction tag. Probably any number of variations I could come up with if I want to, but anyway, booktube. If you would like to do this tag, consider yourselves tagged, and I will be back tomorrow with a new video. Might be another tag, might be an attempt at a discussion, could be a book haul. I do have a lonely slam volume of poetry right there, which I'm holding on to until I have a few more slim volumes of poetry to haul. But there's a few other books that are coming in too, so I'll probably do at least a few hauls in the next few days. So anyway, booktube, until I see you tomorrow, thank you, have a great afternoon, and stay safe.